Tasks to accomplish in the introduction, body, and conclusion of a persuasive speech presentation. At the beginning of this course, we went over specific tasks to accomplish in the introduction, body, and conclusion of an informative speech. Now that we are moving on to speaking to persuade in the fourth speech presentation, we will slightly modify those tasks and add to them for the purposes of speaking to persuade. In the introduction, there are now 5 tasks to accomplish. We still have the 4 that we had before, which are establish the main idea, establish common ground with your audience, establish a personal connection to the subject, and preview a specific number of points. And we will add a 5th to those 4, which is define your terms and set clear parameters. Let's review the 4, and then we'll get to that new task after we've reviewed the first 4. In establishing the main idea, remember you are establishing what the thesis statement or the universal point is that you mean to convey to your audience. You will know you have an acceptable main idea if it passes that main idea smell test, which is the 4 criteria that a main idea must meet in order for it to be considered well developed. If your main idea is well developed, it must be universal, not autobiographical. It must be able to be expressed in a complete grammatical sentence. It must assert a singular idea, and it must make an assertion that is beyond the obvious and not overly simplistic. The next task that we'll review is to establish common ground with your audience. And that is to briefly reveal something about yourself that humanizes you or establishes that you are in some way, even though you're the one making the presentation, one of us in the audience. The next task is to establish a personal connection to the subject, or in this case, the controversial issue. In order to establish that personal connection, your credibility with the issue with regard to this subject, you should plan to briefly answer those same 2 questions. How did you first encounter this issue? And what is a personality trait of yours that caused you to value and remember this issue when you first did encounter it? The next task is to preview the specific number of points you will be covering in detail in the body. In the body of your persuasive speech, you should have 3 or more reasons why the audience will benefit from making the change you propose. The persuasive points in the body should be reasons why the audience will benefit, and you give each one a name and list them briefly here. So preview a specific number of, in this case, persuasive points. Preview a specific number of points that will be covered in detail in the body. Now we get to the new 5th task in the introduction, now that we're speaking to persuade, and it's an important one. Define your terms, set clear parameters. In short, you must specify what change related to the issue that you want us to make. Give any relevant background information, only what we absolutely need to know, be brief, in order to understand the reasoning behind your persuasive points. For example, you should briefly and clearly explain what you mean by fastest. If you were going to assert later in the speech something like, the cheetah is the fastest animal in the world. Fastest how? In terms of cross-country, in terms of short sprints. Here is where you should define your terms and set a clear parameter which is directly related to the specific purpose in the headings. So in short, you must specify what change related to the issue that you want us to make. If you don't set clear parameters here, we won't know what you're proposing. We may know how you feel about the issue, that may be very clear, but we won't know what you want us to do about it. What attitude, belief, or behavior you want us to change, unless you specify what and for how long. At the end of the speech, we may say, well, it's clear to me that you feel very passionate about this side of the issue, and your position is clear, but I don't know what you want me to do about it. Unless you propose something specific, you will often get that reaction. Moving on to the body. When we were speaking to inform, we had only one task, to elaborate in detail in the body on the points previewed. The second task in the body, now that we're speaking to persuade, is to address opposing arguments. Well, we still have to elaborate in detail in the body on the points previewed. So let's talk about what that entails when we're speaking to persuade. Elaborate in detail on the persuasive points, giving specific examples, again, using facts and/or testimony to support your assertions. You should also use your own reasoning in conjunction with your forms of support. Don't expect your audience to reason out your points for you. In terms of organization, you should devote one topic in the body to each of your persuasive points, of which you should have at least 3. The names of the topics in the body of your persuasive speech should be worded so that they are responses to the following potential audience question. Imagine the audience was asking you, give me 3 or more good reasons why I should make the change that you propose. So each of your persuasive points should be given a name that could potentially answer that question. The second task in the body, now that we're speaking to persuade, is to address opposing arguments. Address any opposing arguments that immediately come to mind, giving specific examples and again using facts and testimony for support. Remember, you can't pretend there are no opposing arguments and just not address them. The opposing arguments that are immediately apparent will leap into the minds of your audience, whether or not you mention them, and they're likely to tune you out if you just pretend these arguments don't exist. This, however, is a judgment call, because you don't want to give undue attention to a minor opposing argument that might not otherwise occur to your audience. Keep in mind that opposing arguments are often based in apathy and/or denial. You may wonder, how should opposing arguments be incorporated into the three-point outline? If each of the topics in the body of your persuasive speech represent the persuasive points, opposing arguments should be addressed as subtopics or sub-subtopics underneath whichever persuasive point of yours that is most relevant to it. The conclusion of your persuasive speech. We again have the same three tasks you had before. Review the points, restate the main idea, and call your audience to action. Let's review them. You review the points briefly as you went through them in the introduction. Restate the main idea, again, briefly, as you did in the introduction. The call to action. Again, I remind you that a good way to frame your call to action is to preface it with a phrase like, "So the next time you," and complete that thought with a specific but common hypothetical problem that could come up in the everyday life of your average audience member, in which the action taken to resolve the problem is reflective of your main idea, and in this case, the controversial issue itself. You should even work into that call to action, if you can, the exact proposal that you made in the introduction when you set your parameter and defined your terms. We've gone over the revised list of tasks to include in the introduction, body, and conclusion now that we are speaking to persuade.